This talk, the idea was, I've been reading a lot about karma, and I've been thinking about the what's called the 12-fold, or the 12 links of the chain of causation, also known as the teaching of dependent origination. And what I will say is, as part of writing this, or putting together this Dharma Talk, we always say that, like, the Dharma Talk really doesn't happen until we're all together in this room. But it's really true, because I had a little bit of, like, Dharma writer's block, and I was trying to come up with some good anecdotes or stories or tie-ins to kind of illustrate some of these points, and I really had a hard time coming up with them. So what I invite you to do throughout this talk is let it spur thoughts for you of stories that maybe this makes you think of, and then in the discussion and question time afterwards, maybe I'll ask you to share some of those, and we can kind of, and we'll call that part of it. I was thinking about one of our opening chants when we start services in the morning, about which is, we call kind of confession and repentance, and that's the chant that says, "All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow." And so, in a little bit of my being stuckness, what I tried to take some of my own medicine. I've been thinking a lot about first principles lately, and how that when we're stuck, we can go back to these first principles to see what our primary focus should be. Basically, stopping and pausing and thinking about, what are we trying to do in the first place? Where are we trying to get to? And then getting into how we want to get there. So it's kind of about intention setting and direction setting. And so I thought, the Buddha's first principles that he taught were the Four Noble Truths. The first one is of the truth of suffering, or dukkha, that it exists and it seemingly permeates everything that we do. Dukkha is a particular kind of suffering. It's the suffering of not getting what you want, or getting something you don't want. And this push and pull of wanting and not wanting is called, respectively, greed and hatred, or aversion. And greed and hatred are two forms of clinging. And the mental sensation of this clinging is dukkha. That's the suffering that Buddha was talking about. So I had an example. I was trying to think of a good example for that. And I'm very lowbrow, so this is like what came to me. So I thought, okay, imagine grabbing for something that you want, and it's just out of reach. So you're sitting in your car, you're in the driver's seat, you're stopped at a red light, and you have something in your hands. It's maybe a French fry, or a McNugget, or whatever your McNugget equivalent is. And just before your fingers reach your mouth, it tumbles out of your hand between the seat and the console, just out of reach. And if you're an observer of the 5-second rule, as I am, you know that you only have a moment to retrieve it before it loses its ritual purity and is lost forever. So that feeling, as your arm is stretched underneath the seat, clawing around, and the traffic light is turning green, the thing is just out of reach, the frustration, the grief, the anger, the hopelessness, all from the clinging. That is all dukkha. So if you're a person who can lose something under the driver's seat and effortlessly accept this unfortunate turn of events, you are what is called an arhat. It's an enlightened being. And I bow very deeply to you, and this talk is for everyone else. The second noble truth is that suffering has a cause. And I've kind of already talked about the cause because it's hard not to, which is that suffering is caused by attachment or clinging. In other words, greed and hatred. And it's the attachment to the thought or feeling that things, something, anything should be kind of different than the way that it is. It's hard not to talk about suffering and its cause together because one really follows the other. As the Buddha has put it, it's like your shadow following you around on a sunny day, or like the wheel of an ox cart following closely behind the ox to which it's hitched. As goes clinging, so goes dukkha. The third noble truth is that there is a possibility for suffering to be stopped by stopping the craving. It's easier said than done, maybe, but it's doable. And the fourth noble truth is that there's a path to the ending of suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha has been described as the great healer or the great physician. And the four noble truths follow a medical model: the diagnosis, which is suffering; the underlying cause, which is clinging; the prognosis, which is curable; and the prescription, which is more cowbell. It's not more cowbell. It's the Eightfold Path, which is a way of living our lives to accomplish two things: seeing through our deluded concept of the world, and thus getting to the underlying root cause of clinging, which is ignorance of the way things actually are. And from this base of wisdom, acting with compassion so that we create the causes of happiness for ourselves and others. The first part of the Eightfold Path is right view, which is essentially correct understanding of how the world works. So, what is karma itself? Our confessional chant says that it's ancient and it's twisted, but what is it? The first thing I remember ever hearing about Buddhism was from my junior year high school history teacher, Mr. Sheldon Obelsky. And he summarized Buddhism as this. And I grew up in Boston, just FYI. If you do the Dhamma, you get good karma. It's not terribly far off. I don't think that he realized that his Boston accent was giving the pronunciation in ancient Pali as opposed to Sanskrit. But that's okay. Karma is kama. So karma is a concept. It actually predates Buddhism, but the understanding has evolved, and the Buddha expounded a very different understanding of karma for his day. Karma in its most basic form is the law of cause and effect. But, so because of this, that happens. That's pretty straightforward. But it's not simply mechanical functioning in the way that we think about it, but cause and effect in the ethical realm. And how that operates from a Buddhist perspective is very nuanced. Prior to Buddhism, the concept of karma involved somewhat fixed views. So the fixed view of karma accords well with the fixed view of the self. So imagine that you're a human being and that you are composed of two components of two primary categories, things that arise in new and different forms and configurations depending on circumstances, and then something else, a fixed, unchanging quality. You might call this a soul or the Atman. And from lifetime to lifetime, your outer form might come together and decompose, changing appearance and form, but the inner quality remains, perpetuating the continuous existence of you through the cycle of birth and death. And this is a great oversimplification, but this, for our purposes, it works. In that kind of a world, karma operates in a very fixed way, and the way you are is a result of your past karma. And we can quickly see how this can be socially problematic. For example, for one, it easily justifies the existence of a fixed social structure or caste system. Since you're the same soul from lifetime to lifetime, your rebirth into your current circumstances is a direct result of your own prior karma, positive or negative, and thus you deserve to get whatever you're currently getting, whether that may be rewarding or punishing. And so what the Buddha taught, which was pretty radical for its time, and it might still be kind of radical, was an-atman. The an, it's the same linguistic root as our anti, so negating the existence of a fixed, perpetual, unchanging self. Instead, he taught shunyata, or emptiness, which is that all things are empty of own being, that they have no permanent fixed self. And he said that we're actually composed of 5 aggregates or heaps, those being form, which include matter and the 5 senses, perception, which involves identifying an object of experience, feeling or sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, consciousness, and mental formations or volition, which involves a conditioned response to the object of experience. This probably sounds familiar from the Heart Sutra that we chanted this morning. The Heart Sutra teaching goes even further, saying that even these processes and concepts are empty of own being. But for now, it suffices to look at things on this level of these aggregates. What this means for us is that our karma is not fixed. It's dynamic because everything is dynamic. This means that our fate is changeable, not fixed, which is excellent news in terms that we are not predestined for any particular outcome. But it also means that we bear some responsibility in making ethically sound decisions in what we choose to say and what we choose to do and even what we choose to think. I have here note to myself, example of small actions compounding over time. So you can think to yourself of an example of small things which compound over time and influence each other. So closely related to karma is the concept of dependent origination. This is the idea that nothing exists or comes into existence on its own accord, but in conjunction with and as a result of causes and conditions. There's a great quote from, put it somewhere, oh, there it is, from Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer. And he once said, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the entire universe. Nothing comes about on its own accord. Leaving aside Big Bang and whatever happened to make that happen. And the Buddha never really got into, where did the universe come from? He was really about, this is suffering and this is how we end suffering. So everything comes about as a result of causes and conditions. As part of the teaching, for those who are not familiar, the teaching of dependent origination is the Buddha's explanation of how we kind of stay stuck in what's called the cycle of birth and death, the wheel of samsara, and of course suffering that goes along with it. So it looks something like this. Well, these are the parts anyways. There's ignorance of the causes of suffering. There's volitional formations, the concepts and structures in our mind that condition our choices, the sort of like unconscious. There's sense consciousness, that's awareness. And there's name and form, the physical and mental aspects of our experience. The 6 sense fields, so that's our 5 senses plus the mind. The Buddha considered the mind to be its own sense field. So being aware of thoughts is a sense, as well as hearing and seeing and tasting and touching. smelling. There's contact. I'll kind of get into that. Feeling tone. This is positive, negative, neutral. And then craving and clinging. What's called becoming, which is the sort of habitual clinging that kind of crystallizes into long-term patterns of preference and habit, which manifest as personality and identity. And then there's birth, and then there's aging and decay and death, which includes sorrow and lamentation and pain and grief and despair. It doesn't necessarily all happen in that particular order, so depending on your cosmology, there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. The traditional way is this is actually what drives our continued existence over time, from lifetime to lifetime. And I'm not sort of advocating for or against that view. Bless you. And it's also, it's also very apt in describing moment to moment, because actually everything is happening dynamically, and it's happening really rapidly, such that we don't really perceive it, but you can start to kind of look at it and examine this with your mind and see that some of this is going on. So the underlying conditions are, you've got ignorance of what's going to make you suffer, and you've got sort of conditioned psychology about how you react to the world, and then you've got sense consciousness, awareness, and then that sense consciousness and the six sense fields, the hearing, the seeing, and etc., and name and form, that's the actual physical aspects of experience and also the mental aspects of experience, all come together in contact. And the Buddha says that's what experience is, right? You have to have consciousness, you have to have let's say to see something, you have to have an eye, you have to have, a sense consciousness, vision, and you have to have an object to see. And you put those three things together and there's contact. And then very rapidly what happens is we have a perception, and we oftentimes have a feeling as part of that perception that this is good and I want more of it, or it's bad and I want less of it, or I don't have an opinion about it. It's neutral. And from there, you can have, I really want it, craving, and it's like, I have to have it, clinging. And that gets sort of solidified into, this is how I am and this is how that is. And this drives the next moment happening. And then, of course, anything that starts has to end. Birth leads to death, karmically. And this all happens like that. But there is an opportunity to intervene in that. And it's when that contact happens, and the easiest way in is probably that feeling tone, where you can examine it. And that's something you can do in meditation. That's sort of why meditation is helpful, is it gives us a chance to slow down our thinking and recognize these things happening. There's a quote frequently misattributed to Aristotle, and actually written by American historian Will Durant, which says that we are what we habitually do. He was sort of summarizing Aristotle. The difficulty with karma is that it does seem to be ancient and essentially untraceable and inextricable, and it can be hard to get to the root of our own difficulties in a single day, let alone a lifetime or history stretching back eons. and muddying the waters is that our karma exists in this multidimensional continuum of myriad causes and conditions. But what we can certainly do is focus on the here and now and interrupt the cycle of this habit energy and start unwinding some of it. And I think a lot of you are probably already doing this a lot of the time, but I'll kind of restate it. There's an acronym, a handy little acronym. It's called RAIN. And it's something you can do really anytime, but especially if you're on the cushion, you can practice this. And it's RAIN, R-A-I-N. And the R is for recognize. It means recognize a thought or feeling as arising. So if you're sitting and you think of something and like anger comes up about something, you can recognize anger. Anger is arising. And the A then is for accept. So you can accept the thought or feeling without resisting it or trying to change it. So a lot of times what will happen with me is like something like anger arises and it doesn't feel good and I don't want to feel it. And so then I'll try to like push it away, think of something else, or just start feeling lousy and that have that whole cycle of suffering. But actually, you can practice with accepting this thought or feeling without resisting it, trying to change it. One thing I sometimes do is if there's a feeling I'm not particularly fond of, especially when I'm sitting, is I try to imagine this feeling is like a toddler. And maybe the toddler's having a temper tantrum, or the toddler's rambunctious or sad. And so what I'll say is, okay, well, you know what, you can be here, and but we're just going to sit right now. But you're allowed to stay, and you're allowed to be angry or be sad or be anxious or be confused. But right now we're sitting, and that kind of helps take some of the juice out of it. The I in RAIN is for investigate. And this is to investigate this thought or feeling and interrogate it. What was the trigger for it arising? Where is this coming from? What does it feel like in my body? What happens in my body that makes this feeling arise? What does this feeling do for what I do in my body? It's like I tend to clench my jaw, and I'll notice that and try to see where did that come from. Try to relax, and then like 5 minutes later, I notice I'm clenching my jaw again. But you can try to cultivate sort of a scientific curiosity about it. And then the N is for not identify, and that just means to try to see this thought or feeling as a component of your experience and not as your identity itself. So, when you first start sitting, when you first start practicing with this, it can feel like, this anger arises and I am the anger. Like anger is me. And the invitation is to sort of see if you can peel that away a little bit. It's almost like peeling a very fine layer of an onion away from the core of the onion. Sometimes it's just so thin and you can peel it away and you're like, I thought that was one thing, but actually it's a whole other layer. And that's something that we can do. And so the acronym there, RAIN, is just to help remind us of that. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I really am interested to see what and if this made you think of, and to hear your stories. I know there are good stories out there. So I look forward to it. And we'll have Q&A right after tea and coffee. So So we'll close this out first. Thank you.